Okay, friends, we are ready to look at and move on to our third place that the Reformation is going to begin. We ended yesterday talking about John Calvin, how Calvin is now the more significant, or plays a more significant role in the Protestant movement than Martin Luther. Martin Luther is still staying with that same ideas of Lutheranism. Protestantism has expanded and going to confront a lot of different other types of religious questions. But now we're going to really, really shift gears, because all of this discussion at this point about Protestant Reformation, Lutheranism, Catholicism, Calvinism, really have all been religious questions. It all has been about what different ideas mean, the translation of the sacred text, what and how are the ways to get to achieve salvation. And they've all been very rooted in biblical scripture and these analytical, thought processing, lawyer kind of church officials. And we're now going to really change gears, places, and move to the Reformation in England. And I already tell you right up front, this is going to be different. This is about politics. This is not about religion. This is about Henry VIII needing a male heir. So one of the important things to remember at this point is who Henry VIII is and where and how he got his little, it's not little, his Fanny on the throne. His father wins it on the battlefield. And prior to Henry VII winning the throne and taking it off the head of Richard III by stabbing a sword down his spinal column on a battlefield, England had been in the middle of a huge civil war. It's called the War of the Roses, if you know anything about that. The Plantagenets and the Lancasters fighting constantly, and Henry VII wins, sits himself on the throne, has lots of children, and is beginning to establish what's going to be known as the Tudor dynasty. Henry is the second son. His brother Arthur was supposed to be king, and Henry, as a second son, was a devoutly religious young man. And in doing so was probably, had his life not had a change, destined to enter the Catholic Church. What happens is his brother, who is at this point engaged to Catherine of Aragon, they are betrothed. Spain is a most Catholic nation. England is a most Catholic nation. And England desires to make a partnership with Spain, who is at this point one of the most powerful countries. So they marry their two children together. So Arthur, Prince Arthur, and Catherine of Aragon, at a very early age, probably about the age of 5, they had been betrothed, and that's a contract, sign on the dotted line. Catherine moves to England when she's about 12 or 13 to become accustomed to English ways, to learn how to speak. She and Arthur meet. They will have time to get to know each other, and then they get married. And very shortly after they get married, within the first, I believe, 6 month, Arthur dies of what then is called the sweating sickness. It's this sickness that comes over you. You sweat profusely and you die very quickly. And that leaves two things in a lurch. It leaves Catherine in a big lurch, because now she's not really anything. She's the widow of Arthur. But it leaves Henry the Seventh, the King of England, in a bind as well, because he no longer has his match with Spain that he's trying to get. Henry the Eighth now moves up to Prince, future king. Henry the Seventh and the King of Spain still want this connection. So they say, let's just marry Henry to Catherine. Henry is about 6 or 7 years younger than Catherine. Catherine is older. But there is a problem because biblical scripture says that is sinful. You cannot lay with your brother's wife in some way in Leviticus, where it says all of those things that you must not do. So, because these two kings of England and King of Spain want this event to happen, they send a special letter to the Pope. It's called a dispensation, and ask, Pope, can we get special permission? Now we're going to have to get a little bit adulty here in this room. Pope says the only way it can happen is if the marriage was never consummated, which means they did things together that adults do in a bed after they're married. Did they do that? Catherine says, no, we did not. Catherine's going to say, no, she did not, because Catherine wants to be the Queen of England. This is the biggest question mark, National Enquirer, TMZ story of the world. Did they or did they not? Don't know. It's going to be a really important deal. Catherine says no. She stands in front of the Pope and she says, no, I did not. So they are allowed to get married. They get married. For all practical purposes, they really like each other. Catherine is very smart. Henry is very smart. They get along very well together. Catherine has a series of pregnancies, miscarriages, babies born as what's called stillbirth, and eventually she finally has a girl child named Mary. Henry loves her. Catherine loves her. She's raised as a Catholic child. In the middle of all this, Martin Luther is doing his Protestant thing, and King Henry VIII writes this scathing letter in defense of the Catholic Church and mails it off to the Pope. The Pope says, Henry, you are so awesome. I am awarding you this big, giant belt buckle. Think of like wrestling belt buckle. I don't even know what they call them anymore. Wrestling championship, big belt buckle kind of thing, big silver thing that says Defender of the True Faith. And Henry is so proud of that. But the problem is, Catherine keeps having miscarriages and she can't have a child. So in the back of Henry's head are two things. The goal of a king is to have a son and to have many sons. Also in the back of his head is that the only reason he is a king is because his dad won it on a battlefield, not a direct lineage, not a heritage, not a hereditary throne. And Henry knows I can lose it just as quickly. I need sons. In the meantime, he sees this fancy new girl who happens to be one of Catherine's ladies in waiting, who's always hanging around. And she's very, very appealing. What eventually will be called, she was bewitching. Emphasis on the last word, witch. So Catherine have a daughter, Mary. We do not have female queens yet in England. Henry says, I got to get rid of Catherine. I got to get rid of Catherine because I see this new, really enticing girl that I'm sure she will give me sons. He appeals to the Pope. I need to annul this marriage. I need it gone. I need to do that. Now, that is not unusual for that to happen because the king's role is to have sons. The problem is that he already had special permission to marry Catherine. The other problem is in our previous notes, we've been talking about that Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. That's her nephew. Her parents are Isabella and Ferdinand from, which we'll get in our next chapter. Some of you may know Isabella and Ferdinand, who sent Columbus on his voyage. She has close connections with the Pope, and he is not going to let that happen. So, Henry says, I need to get a divorce. I need annulment. And Catherine says, nope, 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 not doing it. I'm not risking my salvation and my soul. I'm not doing it. In the meantime, Henry has already started seeing Anne Boleyn. She is now going to have a baby. He really needs a divorce. And so what does he do? He creates his own church. The Archbishop of Canterbury ruled that Henry's marriage to Catherine is null and void. And this poor woman is dragged in front of a court. And what we just discussed in this room about what happened on the wedding night of Arthur and Catherine, she is interrogated in front of a whole room full of men about that event. She is sent off, and so is Mary. So overnight, Princess Mary becomes Lady Mary. She loses her status in the family. And sadly, Henry keeps Mary and her mother apart for the rest of their lives. So Mary will never see her mother again. Henry holds that over her head. And Henry creates the new Church of England. So the Act of Supremacy in 1534 ruled that the king was the supreme head of the new church. And in doing so, everyone now had to recognize that Henry is the head of the church. It is important to note that Henry doesn't change anything. This is why we say this is political. He keeps the 7 sacraments. He keeps all of the belief systems of the Catholic Church. And all he really does is erase Catholic Church and write Church of England, my church. I'm the head. So overnight, politically, Henry VIII has become the head of the church as well as the King of England. He holds a considerable amount of power in his hands. And that Act of Supremacy is going to be one of the things that Mary Tudor is going to live in fear for the rest of her life of her dad cutting off her head. Her dad threatens many times. Say I'm the head of the church. Mary says, I cannot. The head of my church is the Pope. I am risking my salvation if I recognize you. Her dad says, I'm going to cut off your head. For real. She moves around all over the place. Again, not being allowed to see either her mother. She is not allowed to be in the castle at all. She is about 16 or 17 years old. Meanwhile, her dad now marries Anne. Well, let me stop here. Let me just finish telling the story because that's not the rest. So he now marries Anne Boleyn, who immediately presents him with another daughter. That would be Elizabeth I. Not what he expected. Now I need to find a way to get rid of her. And when I told the story at the beginning that she was bewitched with the keyword witch, and that is what Anne Boleyn is going to get charged with, bewitching Henry, making him so addle-brained that he can't make good choices. And she's also going to be accused of having intimate relationships with her brother. She's also going to be charged with a witch, and she is going to get her head cut off. Henry still really likes Anne Boleyn, so instead of getting her head cut off with an English hatchet that might take about 4 failed swoops to remove your head, it's hard to cut off a head with a hatchet, he hires a professional swordsman from France with a very sharp sword to cut her head off in one fell swoop. Head's gone. So let me make sure I don't have any of this in here. Yep, nope, none of that's in here. This is just the fun part. So then the next part is his third wife is Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour had been, guess what, a lady of waiting to Anne Boleyn. He marries Jane Seymour. She's not a very smart young girl. She's very young. She does have a son. That would be Edward. She dies about 3 to 4 weeks after childbirth. She never gets up out of the childbed, as they say. She probably had some kind of blood poisoning or she hemorrhaged. So she dies, and now we have the heir to the throne, Edward. He still wants another wife. He is then put in the direction of, because now he's Protestant, in the direction of a Protestant wife called Anne of Cleves. She is from the northern Germanic states. They send, he's like, what does she look like? He gets a picture, right? A portrait. Oh, okay, she's cute. Let me get married to her. So they arrange everything. She comes in. He sees her. And he says, whoever painted that portrait lied. She is ugly. I do not want her as a wife. Anne of Cleves said, no problem, dude. I see what happens to your wives. We'll just pretend that we're brother and sister. And so Henry signs this contract to my dear sweet sister Anne of Cleves, who lives there forever in the castle for about 40 more years as Henry's sister, and actually becomes one of his great confidants. Still need another wife. Now, back to the Boleyns. They have a side little family group called the Howards. The Boleyns and the Howards are always trying to finagle to get in with the king. They have another daughter. And guess what? Her name is Catherine again, Catherine Howard. And Henry falls again for a pretty face. Even though you're screaming, it's the Howards. They are going to try to take your power. Don't marry into the Howard family. He marries into the Howard family. He marries into the Howard family, and Catherine has been very free with herself and still is, and has an affair while she's married to the king, and that is treason. You cannot do that. And guess what happens to her? She gets her head cut off. Head cut off. Now, do what? It was. Boom. So, the next thing that we're doing is now we have Mary. We have Mary. We have Elizabeth, and Edward. And all of these heirs to the throne are being moved all around. And what is happening is the king is getting old. He's getting fat. He can barely move. He has ulcers all over his legs, probably from diabetes and gout. He can't move very well. He does marry yet again another Catherine Parr. Thankfully, she survives him. But at this point, everyone is lining up behind a child. Mary as a Catholic. So all the Catholic supporters are lining up behind her. Edward, the son, who's a Protestant, obviously has a lot of supporters. And then we have little old Elizabeth that's hanging out over here, whose my dad cut off my mom's head kind of relationship that she has. And she has her group that's there. Eventually, again, all of this is going to explode when Henry dies. So that is a lovely story. That is a big part of what your assignment is, reading through all of those as well. So the problem now becomes you have a whole entire Catholic nation who believes and devoutly believes the head of their church is the Pope. And Henry is going to make them bow down to him. So why does Henry need this new church? The most important part is he needs a male heir. And he is going to get that male heir. Sadly, Edward is going to only be alive for about 3 to 4 years. Does anybody have a 10-year-old brother? 10 to 12-year-old brother? Your brother is now the king. Imagine what that would be like. I know. Imagine. That's going to be what happens. He married his brother's wife, and scriptures condemn that act. That's why Henry truly believed he was not allowed to have a son, that God was punishing him because of his sinful act. Third part is his treasury is low, and this is where we get into the politics. If I become the head of the church, I get all the church's stuff. And one of the first things that Henry is going to do is close up all the monasteries and take all of their stuff, and more importantly, all of their land, and began to sell it. He would control all parts of the church, so he would be powerful as a monarch and powerful as a religious leader. And one of the important things, again, to remember is that he does not change any parts of the church. And it is also really important to remember when Henry is on his deathbed, he converts back to Catholicism and he dies as a Catholic, which again tells you this had nothing to do with religion for Henry. It had to do with, I need a son and I need some money. And where can I find it? I can find it at church. In the middle of that as well, Henry has some people that work for him in his privy council. And to be a part of his privy council, you must take the oath that Henry is the head of the church. Sir Thomas More, who again eventually becomes a knight, says, I cannot take the oath of supremacy. Thomas More will not do that. We met Thomas More at the beginning of this chapter. You should have put him on your Northern Renaissance for Utopia, the vernacular of Utopia. He writes this book. He is a devoutly religious man. He has persecuted for many years Protestants. He has kind of like a torture chamber in the basement of his house. So he eats supper with all of his children. He enlightens and teaches his daughters how to read and write, and they know Latin, and his daughters are like the pearls of England because they're so intelligent. And then at night he goes down and puts Protestants on the rack and pulls out their fingernails and toenails. But Henry will not take the oath of supremacy. His wife, his children beg him, please, just tell Henry what he wants to hear. You know in your heart that he's not the head of your church. And Henry and Thomas says, I can't. Very much the same as Martin Luther. I cannot compromise my spiritual beliefs to appeal to this man. And Henry cuts off his head. It is the one head that Henry regrets as he gets older in his life and he looks back on his life, does not regret. He thinks about Anne Boleyn, doesn't regret it, definitely doesn't regret cutting off Catherine Parr or Catherine Howard, but he does regret Thomas More very much. Henry never really moves his religious teachings very far from the Catholic Church. Henry is going to die, and when Henry dies, Edward the Fourth is now, no, Edward VI from Jane Seymour now becomes king. He is going to move the Church of England way towards Protestantism. So we're moving way towards Protestantism, and then Edward's going to die. I forgot to mention in between Mary and Edward is Lady Jane Grey. She's called the 6-Day Queen. Poor Lady Jane Grey. Edward knows if Mary becomes queen, she will move England back to Catholicism. So he is looking for a new Protestant queen, not Elizabeth, that he can. And he chooses his sister-in-law. She has no direct lineage. And she will be queen for 6 days. And guess what happens to her head? It gets cut off too. Poor Lady Jane Grey. She's 16. She's put in the middle of this Tudor political mess of a family, and she will reign for 6 days, Lady Jane Grey, and will get her head cut off. And then Mary will come to the throne. Mary is the one that many of you might know, and she has the moniker Bloody Mary. And she in no way is as bloody as her father. So Mary is now the Queen of England. She is and will be married to Philip, who is the King of Spain. She, as you might well imagine, has a lot of baggage that she carries with her. One, her father denied her for her whole life not being able to see her mother. Her mother dies alone. Her mother dies in a dank, dark, wet castle. She is taken care of by Henry, but not well taken care of as she would have expected as the queen. Mary's first goal is to go back to Catholicism. She moves everything back to Catholicism. She burns a whole lot of Protestants, creates a whole lot of conflict, turmoil. She too is unable to have any children. And when she dies, in will step Elizabeth I, who will reign as one of the greatest nobles in all of England, not just great queen, but of all nobles. She has a time period named after her, the Elizabethan time. Your assignment, the very last question, is going for tomorrow, or today and tomorrow, mostly tomorrow, is going to ask you about all of everything Henry did to end up with a male son. And ironically, which you're going to look at, the most important noble ruler in the history of England, one of which will be Elizabeth. The irony of all the things he did to get a son, and in the end, his two daughters will be more important than his son. So that, again, will be what we need to think about. Anybody have questions? I love this story very much. It's a cool story, and we didn't even get to any real parts of all of it that goes on in it, but it is a very interesting story. I meant to wear, if today wasn't Jersey Day, I have a shirt. I have a shirt that has all of Henry VIII's wives on it, and I love when I wear it like just during the summertime because it's a t-shirt. People always think it's a band. Oh, is that a band? I'm like, no, it's the wives of Henry VIII. Dead, not all of them. It's divorced, beheaded, died. It's divorced, beheaded, died, beheaded, survived. Because he cuts off two heads. Yeah. I can't imagine walking up there and seeing the executioner, because you have to forgive the way the execution works. The executioner standing up there, he has a mask on because you can't see his face. And you have to forgive the executioner before he executes you. That's part of the process. Like, I forgive you. I forgive you for cutting off my head. And then you lay your head down and you just lay there. And then your head it's just, I don't know how you have the strength to walk up. And people are watching. This is like everybody's watching kind of thing. It's, interesting to say the least. All right. Again,